The burden of sacrifice. The letter trembled in Mira Castellano's hands as she read it for the third time, though the words hadn't changed. The hospital bills, the loan shark's final notice, the bank's foreclosure warning, they all led to one impossible number, 75,000 euros. She sat in the cramped kitchen of their seaside apartment, where paint peeled from the walls like old memories, and tried to imagine where such money could possibly come from. Through the thin walls, she could hear her father's labored breathing from the bedroom. Vincent Castellano had been a proud man once, the kind who sang opera while mending his fishing nets and brought home the day's catch with stories that made the whole neighborhood laugh. That was before the accident on the docks, before the spine injury that left him unable to work, before the medical bills began piling up like storm clouds. Mira pressed her palms against her eyes, fighting back tears. She was 24 years old, working double shifts at the Portovento bookshop for barely enough to cover groceries. Her dreams of studying literature at university had evaporated 2 years ago when her mother, Rosa, had fallen ill. The heart disease had come suddenly, viciously, and despite some miracle that had granted her mother the surgery she needed, Rosa had passed away 6 months later. The grief was still fresh, and now her father was slipping away too, not from illness, but from the crushing weight of debt and despair. The knock at the door startled her. Mira wasn't expecting anyone, and visits had become rare since their financial troubles became neighborhood gossip. She opened the door to find a man in an immaculate charcoal suit, his dark hair swept back, his gray eyes assessing her with an intensity that made her step backward. "Mira Castellano?" His voice was smooth, cultured, nothing like the rough dialect of Portovento. "Who's asking?" "My name is Damien Thornwell. I have a proposition that could solve your family's financial difficulties." He handed her a business card with elegant lettering. Thornwell Enterprises, followed by an address in the capital city. Mira's heart hammered. "I don't understand. What kind of proposition? May I come in? This conversation is better had in private." Against her better judgment, she let him enter. He stood in their modest kitchen, somehow making the space feel even smaller with his presence. He didn't sit, didn't touch anything, just looked at her with those penetrating eyes. "I need a wife," he said simply. "For personal reasons I won't elaborate on now, I require a marriage. In exchange, I will pay all of your father's debts, provide for his medical care, and ensure you both live comfortably. All I ask is 1 year of your time as my legal spouse." Mira stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "You're asking me to marry you? A complete stranger?" "I am." His expression revealed nothing. "You have 48 hours to decide. After that, the offer expires." He left as abruptly as he'd arrived, leaving Mira standing in the kitchen, holding a business card and drowning in impossible choices. The wedding of shadows. The church of Santa Margarita had never felt so cold. Mira stood in a borrowed white dress, nothing fancy, just a simple cotton gown that Lucia had found at a second-hand shop, and tried to steady her breathing. 2 days had passed since Damien's offer. 2 days of watching her father cough blood into handkerchiefs he tried to hide from her. 2 days of counting coins that would never be enough. The decision had made itself. "You don't have to do this," Lucia whispered, squeezing her hand. Her childhood friend had been the only guest Mira invited, unable to bear the pitying looks of neighbors who would see this for what it was, a transaction. "Yes, I do," Mira replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Father Benedict stood at the altar, his weathered face creased with concern. He'd known Mira since she was a child, had baptized her in this very church. When Damien had arranged the ceremony, the old priest had pulled Mira aside, asking if she was certain, if she was safe. She'd lied and said yes to both. The church doors opened and Damien entered with a younger man beside him. Where Damien was all sharp edges and controlled intensity, this man had softer features and kind brown eyes that smiled even when his mouth didn't. "My brother Julian," Damien introduced curtly. "He'll serve as witness." Julian shook Mira's hand warmly. "I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances. But for what it's worth, my brother is not a cruel man, whatever appearances suggest." The ceremony was brief, mechanical. Father Benedict rushed through the words as if speed might somehow diminish the wrongness of it all. Damien's responses were measured, emotionless. Mira's voice cracked only once when she said, "I do," and realized she'd just bound herself to a man whose favorite color she didn't know, whose childhood she couldn't imagine, whose heart, if he had one, was locked behind walls she couldn't see. The ring he slipped on her finger was simple platinum, elegant but impersonal. It felt heavy as a shackle. "You may kiss the bride," Father Benedict said quietly, almost apologetically. Damien leaned forward and pressed his lips to her forehead instead, a gesture so unexpected and oddly gentle that Mira felt tears prick her eyes. Then it was done. She was Mira Thornwell now, a name that fit her like borrowed shoes. The car that drove them to his estate was silent except for the rain drumming on the roof. Mira watched Portovento disappear behind them, the familiar crooked streets and salt-worn buildings giving way to manicured countryside. Damien's mansion, she couldn't call it anything else, loomed ahead, all stone and iron gates and windows that reflected the storm clouds like dark mirrors. Inside, the house was beautiful and utterly empty. High ceilings, expensive furniture, fresh flowers in crystal vases, but no photographs, no personal touches, nothing that suggested anyone actually lived here. "Your room is upstairs." "Second door on the left," Damien said, his first words since the church. "Mine is at the end of the hall. You're free to go anywhere in the house. Staff will bring meals. If you need anything, tell Julian. He manages the household." "What exactly do you expect from me?" Mira asked, finding her voice. "Nothing tonight? We'll discuss the arrangement properly tomorrow." He started to walk away, then paused. "Your father's debts have been paid. I had Dr. Holden, the best pulmonary specialist in the country, examine him this afternoon. He'll begin treatment on Monday." Before she could respond, before she could ask how he'd arranged that so quickly, Damien disappeared into the shadows of his own home. The whisper that changed everything. Mira couldn't sleep. The bed in her designated room was too soft, the silence too profound after years of hearing the sea through thin walls. She lay in the darkness, her mind spinning through everything that had happened, trying to find the logic in this bizarre arrangement. Why would a wealthy man need to buy a wife? What was she really here for? Around midnight, she heard footsteps in the hallway. Against her better judgment, Mira slipped out of bed and opened her door a crack. Damien stood at the window at the end of the corridor, still dressed, staring out at the rain-soaked gardens. Even from behind, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he gripped the windowsill as if bracing against something invisible. She should have gone back to bed. Instead, she found herself walking toward him. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, his face briefly unguarded. In that moment, she saw something she hadn't expected. Pain. Deep, old pain that had carved itself into permanent residence behind his eyes. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his mask sliding back into place. Strange bed. Strange house? Strange husband? She tried for lightness, but it came out edged with bitterness. "You're angry. That's fair." "I'm confused," Mira corrected. "You paid 75,000 euros for a wife you don't want. That's not a business arrangement. That's madness." Damien was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if memorizing it. Then he asked, "Do you trust me?" "I don't even know you." "No," he agreed softly. "But you will." "Tell me, Mira, 2 years ago your mother needed heart surgery. Emergency valve replacement. The procedure cost 30,000 euros, money you didn't have. But somehow an anonymous donor paid the entire amount. Do you remember?" Mira's breath caught. She remembered. God, she remembered the miracle of it, the impossible relief, the confusion and gratitude that had overwhelmed her family. They'd tried to find out who had helped them, but the hospital would only say the donor wished to remain anonymous. "That was you," she whispered. "Yes." Damien's expression didn't change, but something in his voice softened. "I was in the hospital that day visiting a colleague. I overheard you in the corridor, begging the billing office for more time, explaining that your mother would die without the surgery. I heard the desperation in your voice. It reminded me of—" He stopped, jaw tightening. "Reminded you of what?" "My mother," he said finally. "Eleanor Thornwell. She died when I was 12 because we couldn't afford the medication she needed. My father had gambling debts, you see. He chose cards over her life. I watched her fade away, watched her apologize to me for dying, as if it was her fault. His hands clenched into fists. I swore that day that I would never let money be the reason someone lost their mother. So when I heard you, I paid. Anonymously, because I didn't want gratitude. I wanted to fix something I couldn't fix 20 years ago. Tears streamed down Mira's face as the pieces fell into place. But she died anyway, 6 months later. I know. I kept track. When I learned she'd passed, I looked into your family's situation more closely. Your father's accident, the mounting debts, the loan sharks circling. I watched you work yourself to exhaustion trying to save him the way you couldn't save her. He finally looked at her directly. You were drowning, Mira, and I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. The marriage, it's a convenience for both of us. I need a wife for legal reasons involving my company. You need stability. It seemed logical. Logical? Mira repeated numbly. You married me because you felt guilty about my mother? No, Damien said firmly. I married you because you loved your mother enough to beg strangers for help. Because you love your father enough to marry a stranger for his sake. Because when I saw you in that church today, scared but standing tall, I thought, here is someone who understands what it means to sacrifice. And maybe for 1 year we can help each other survive. The rain had stopped. Through the window, the first hints of dawn were turning the sky violet. Mira looked at this man, her husband, and saw him clearly for the first time. Not a monster or a mystery, but someone as wounded and stubborn as herself, trying to rewrite an ending he couldn't change. 1 year, she said quietly. 1 year, he agreed. Neither of them mentioned that it felt like a promise of something more. Unraveling the truth. 3 months passed in a strange limbo. Mira settled into the mansion's rhythms, learning its quiet routines and careful distances. Damien left for work early and returned late, their interactions brief and polite. He asked about her father. Vincent was improving remarkably under Dr. Holden's care, and she asked about his day. They were like cordial roommates circling each other in vast empty spaces. But small things began to shift. Mira discovered that Damien had converted one of the downstairs rooms into a library filled with first editions and rare volumes. When she mentioned loving Tolstoy, a complete collection appeared on her nightstand. When she complained the house was too quiet, he hired a pianist to play in the evenings. He never asked for thanks, never drew attention to these gestures. But they accumulated like snowfall, silent, persistent, changing the landscape. Julian visited often, and through him, Mira learned fragments of Damien's life, how he'd built his company from nothing, how he'd put himself through university working 3 jobs, how he donated millions anonymously to medical charities. He doesn't know how to accept love, Julian told her once, because he's spent his whole life believing he doesn't deserve it. It was Patricia Gorman who filled in the missing pieces. The private investigator arrived unannounced one Tuesday, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s with information she felt Mira deserved to know. Your husband hired me 6 months before he met you, Patricia explained over tea in the garden. He asked me to identify families in medical crisis, people drowning in healthcare debt. He'd pay their bills anonymously, then move on to the next case. You weren't the first family he helped. You were the 47th. Mira's teacup rattled in its saucer. 47? 47 families. Over 2 million euros all told. But you were different. He kept files on the others for tax purposes, nothing more. With your family, he kept newspaper clippings about your mother's charity work, articles about your father's fishing cooperative. After your mother died, he had me send weekly reports on your well-being. When the loan sharks started threatening your father, he paid them off immediately, months before he ever approached you about marriage. Why are you telling me this? Patricia's expression softened. Because he never will. Damien Thornwell has spent 20 years punishing himself for something that wasn't his fault. He thinks he doesn't deserve happiness, so he arranges his life to ensure he never gets it. But the way he talks about you... She smiled sadly. You're not a charity case to him, Mira. You're the person he couldn't stop thinking about. And he's terrified of that. After Patricia left, Mira sat in the garden until sunset, reconstructing everything she thought she knew. The cold businessman was a boy who'd watched his mother die. The calculated arrangement was a man too afraid to simply ask if she might stay. Every distant gesture was protection. Every impersonal kindness was care filtered through layers of old grief. That night, Damien found her in the library. "Julian said you had a visitor. Patricia Gorman." "Yes. What did she tell you?" His voice was carefully neutral. Mira closed her book and looked at him. Really looked at him, and saw the fear he was trying to hide. "That you've been protecting me since the day my mother got sick. That you married me not because you needed a wife, but because you couldn't think of another way to keep me safe. That you're so busy saving everyone else, you never learned how to save yourself." Damien's composure cracked. "I shouldn't have. This was a mistake. I can arrange a quiet divorce. You can keep the money. Your father will continue to receive care." "Stop," Mira said, standing. She crossed the room until she was close enough to see the silver flecks in his gray eyes. "For once in your life, Damien Thornwell, stop running." "I'm not going anywhere. Why would you stay? This isn't a real marriage. You owe me nothing." "Maybe I'm not staying because I owe you," she said softly. "Maybe I'm staying because when I look at you, I see someone worth knowing. Someone who turned his worst day into a mission to prevent other worse days. Someone who loves so fiercely he can only do it anonymously, because he's afraid of what it means." She reached for his hand, felt it trembling in hers. "You asked me once if I trusted you. I'm asking you now, do you trust me enough to try? Not for a year, not as an arrangement, but as something real?" In answer, Damien pulled her close, his forehead resting against hers, his breath shaky. "I don't know how to do real," he whispered. "Then we'll learn together." The choice of the heart, the foundation, was Mira's idea. 6 months after their conversation in the library, she presented Damien with a full proposal over breakfast, a charitable organization that would help families facing medical bankruptcy, providing not just money but advocacy, guidance, and support. They would call it the Eleanor Rosa Foundation, honoring both their mothers. "We could do more than write checks," Mira explained, her eyes bright with passion. "We could change the system, help people navigate insurance, negotiate bills, connect them with resources. Your money and well, I know what it feels like to be on the receiving end of charity. I know what people actually need." Damien studied the proposal, then studied her, and smiled. A real smile, the kind that transformed his entire face. "When do we start?" They rented an office in Portovento, close enough to the sea that Mira could hear the gulls from her desk. Thomas Reeves, Vincent's old friend from the fishing cooperative, became their community liaison, connecting them with families in need. Dr. Holden joined their medical advisory board. Even Father Benedict contributed, helping them navigate the complicated ethics of charity and dignity. Vincent recovered enough to visit the office, walking with a cane, but walking nonetheless. He clasped Damien's hand with tears in his eyes and said, "Thank you for giving me my daughter's smile back. I thought I'd lost it forever." What Vincent didn't say, what everyone could see, was that Mira had given Damien something back too. The mansion slowly came to life, photographs on the walls, music filling the rooms, laughter echoing in spaces that had been silent too long. Damien still worked too hard, still carried guilt like a stone in his pocket. But Mira was there to remind him that penance and life weren't the same thing. One evening, as they reviewed grant applications in the library that had become their shared space, Damien reached for Mira's hand. "I need to tell you something. The marriage, legally, we could annul it. The year is up next month. You're free to leave if you want." Mira set down her pen. "Is that what you want?" "No," he said immediately, then softer. "No. But I want you to choose me because you want to, not because you're honoring an arrangement." "I want—" He struggled with the words, this man who negotiated million-euro deals without blinking. "I want this to be real. I want you to be my wife because you love me, not because I paid your father's debts." "Damien," Mira said gently, "I fell in love with you the night you told me about your mother. Maybe before that, when I saw how carefully you tried not to let anyone see you care. The debt was paid the moment you let me see the real you." He kissed her then. Not the careful brush of lips from their wedding, but something deep and true. A promise that didn't need contracts or conditions. When they pulled apart, both were crying. "I love you," Damien said, the words clumsy and new in his mouth. "I don't know if I'm any good at it, but I love you." "You're better at it than you think," Mira replied. "You've been loving me all along, you just called it something else." They renewed their vows 6 months later, in the same church but with different words. This time, the pews were full. Families they'd helped, friends they'd made together, Vincent beaming from the front row beside Julian. Father Benedict married them with joy instead of concern, and when Damien kissed his bride, it was the beginning of something neither had dared dream possible. The Eleanor Rosa Foundation thrived, helping hundreds of families navigate their darkest hours. And in the mansion by the sea, two people who'd both known profound loss learned that sometimes the greatest act of courage is letting someone love you back. Years later, when people asked how they met, Mira and Damien would exchange a glance and smile. "She married a stranger to save her family," Damien would say. "And his secret changed everything," Mira would finish. But the real secret, the one they kept close, was simpler. That two broken people had found each other in the wreckage and built something whole.